I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Rob, I think this is going to be going into our weird poetry series, the poem that we're doing today. It's pretty weird.
It's weird, although like a lot of these, there's something kind of nice about what am I saying? Not like a lot of these. I think this is the only one I've done so far about which I would say, hey, this is actually pretty nice.
You know, that poem about Chairman Xi Jinping's backside was I think a sweet love poem.
You know, I have to say, in the much overlooked genre of butt kissing poems, it's a standout. I have to say.
You know, the sycophancy genre doesn't get the attention that it deserves.
It really doesn't. It's much more nuanced than you would think.
So the poem that we're doing today is just called Ji Mao. It's by a poet from the Song Dynasty. His name is Mei Yaochen. And Ji Mao literally translates to something like offering a sacrifice to my cat.
Or for my cat, on behalf of my cat.
Yeah, it's really unclear. There's no preposition in Chinese there, so when you render it into English, it's kind of hard to figure out exactly the direction that things are going. But I just happened to run into this poem. I'm doing some translations, and I'm a big cat person. My wife's a huge cat person. I guess you could say, Rob, I'm a cat guy. Is that a thing?
You are a cat guy.
She's definitely a cat lady.
For sure.
So
cat dude, although that makes it hard to run the T and the D together. It doesn't flow very well.
Cat dude. Cat dude.
Cat dude. I like it. That could be your new name on the podcast.
There we go. It could also be a syndicated television show, maybe.
That'd be amazing. I would totally watch that.
You know, it was just a poem that I thought was really cool because of my love of felines. And so I wanted to translate. It was actually really, really difficult to translate. I had to get a lot of help on Reddit, and there was still some debate about some of the lines. And you know, when we discuss the poem more thoroughly after I read my translation, maybe we can talk about some of that. But it just Rob, is it okay if I just dive in and
Go
read
for it.
my translation?
Do it.
So, Mei Yaochen, offering a sacrifice to my cat. Since I got my cat, Mr. Five White, mice did not attack my books. This morning, Mr. Five White died. I offered a sacrifice of fish and rice. I buried him in the river. I do it to pray for you, not to distance myself from you. Back in the day, you nibbled on a rat. Gnawing on it, you would meow and circle the yard. You wanted to frighten the other mice and to clear them out of my little poop hole house. When I was on a boat, we would stay together in a room. Although my rations were thin, at least I did not have to deal with having mice pissing in and eating my food. The fact is, you worked hard, harder than chickens and pigs. Lots of folks value animals that can pull a plow or drive a cart. They say that cats aren't as good as a horse or a mule. WTF? I don't want to talk about it anymore. Mr. Five White, I will cry for you.
You see what I mean, everyone? It's a nice poem. Like, I wouldn't, if you just gave me that cold with no background, I don't think I would go, wow, that's an all-time classic. But it's a very nice poem. I had to say this too, Lee. Before I even knew who wrote it, and by the way, everyone, Mei Yaochen was a major poet. We'll talk about that in a second, I'm sure. But before I knew anything about it, I guessed it was written in the Song Dynasty. Because...
Why?
Because if you've read a lot of Song Dynasty poetry, there's a lot of poetry that's a little like this. I remember reading a poem, I can't remember who it was anymore, basically cursing out the lice on an animal's back or something. Like, what the frick, guys? Get away from my animal. It reads like that because the song, this is one of the reasons why, honestly, I hope this doesn't make me sound like a nut job, I kind of prefer the song to the Tong, not in terms of necessarily like the sheer poetic quality, than the sort of Wild Westness about it. The song is where everything just blows up and you go like, you want to write a poem about your cat? Write a poem about your cat. Who cares? Go for it.
The the Tang Dynasty is famous for having these kind of blockbuster poets, Li Bai and Du Fu and Li Shangyin and I hesitate to even say Wang Wei, but we'll go ahead and include him in that.
Why not?
The Song Dynasty, it's maybe more subtle, I guess, and it's not blockbusters. You have people writing about random things. I mean, we did a series before on a pair of poems by Zhang Jie and Su Dongpo, or also known as Su She, and it was just about flowers, right? But there's a tradition in particularly song poetry, but it's really true throughout all Chinese poetry. When you're writing about an object like that, you're really writing about the poet's own subjective feelings. Like you're talking about flowers, but really you're actually talking about the poet's emotion. I think that this poem right here, it's very direct, right, Rob? It's not kind of there's not much metaphor. It's just a very loving poem offered in sacrifice. The poem itself is almost the sacrifice. We see the fish and the rice being offered as sacrifices, but the poem itself functions as a sacrifice.
So before I respond to the sacrifice thing, Lee, I wanted to just share with the reader, the listener, that in David Hinton's book, Classical Chinese Poetry, in his section on Mei Yaochen has another poem whose title David Hinton translates as follows: Xia Chi says the ancient masters never wrote a poem about lice, and why don't I write one? That's the title of the poem. I love it. Anyway,
awesome.
No, the poem does work as a kind of sacrifice, and it's interesting though to think this is how the shift has happened, right? I can't imagine a Tang Dynasty poet, first of all, feeling cool taking something as sacred as a sacrifice to a dead family member or something and using it for their cat, and two, taking something as important as poetry and using it for that purpose, right? But that's the song.
Can I correct you?
Go for it.
So I think
Please
that
do.
Li Bai would have probably, he does definitely write death poetry in honor of some of his favorite brewers. But Li Bai is an alcoholic, and so that sort of makes sense. But I think I agree with the thrust of your argument that the Tang just like is grander, but that the song finds beauty in a very kind of narrow vision.
Well, and it allows for more things to be considered beautiful. I mean, even I don't know when this is going to air, but when we did our dual podcast thing about Zhang Jie and Su Shi writing about willow catkins, and the point being that in classical Chinese poetry, it was already Hanyu already mentioned, you don't write about willow catkins. That's silly. No one writes about a poem about something like that. And so Zhang Jie and Su Shi were like, oh, I think we're going to do that.
Again, that's classic because Hanyu is in the Tang. Hanyu is this like major literary figure in the Tang, and there's something that he says, you can't write poetry about that. And then a songwriter goes, wait a second, let me see if I can do that.
And we should point out, too, though, one of the reasons for that is the dominant style of poetry in the song, the zi, is effectively song lyrics, or a lot of them anyway take an existing melody, a song structure, and write a poem based on that, right? It could be used as lyrics for that song, right?
We should make it clear that Tang Dynasty poets do that too, but it's in a slightly the genre of the shi, which is normally translated as poem, I guess puts less emphasis on that. The ci, which could be translated as lyric, puts a bit more emphasis on that. But sorry to complicate your explanation.
No, it isn't. It's a good point to make. Although I again, like you say, I would say that in the song, this is the style. This is the dominant kind of writing. And a lot of poems in the song, the title is just the name of the song. It would be like if all of a sudden we started writing poems based on, I don't know, whatever the popular thing of the day is. Let's say a rap song, right?
So if we wrote all poetry based off of the rhythm of Jay-Z's Big Pimpin', but it didn't necessarily have anything to do with either being big or pimpin'. It was just, oh, wait a second, did we get our musical reference in there?
Yeah. And if the title of your poem was Big Pimpin', but what followed had nothing to do with anything Jay-Z talked about.
It was about flowers.
It's about flowers. Or let's go back to Mei Yaochen, or about lice. Why not? But the reason I bring all that up, though, is because it helps explain why these topics suggest themselves. Because folk writing, these songs and folk story stuff, they already were down in the nitty-gritty, right? The people, quote unquote, were already talking and writing about this stuff anyway. It was only the educated elite that weren't allowed to write about lice or cats or beer, right? Unless you were somebody like Li Bai, who was basically a wild man and could do whatever he wanted.
And who was not famous at the time, or who was not nearly as famous at the time, partially because he was so unconventional and nobody got along with him. And one of the reasons, because he didn't write about the stuff he was supposed to write about.
Right. But here's what's interesting to me about this cat poem. So on the surface, I mean, this is, by the way, one of the things I love about the best Chinese or classical Chinese poetry. You can just read this as an homage to a cat. And if you stop there and you say, I really like that poem, that's totally valid. No problem with that. But there are other things in here. For example, the cat is buried in the water. Now, in the river, rather, but which is made of water, of course. We do.
Thanks for that. Thanks for that clarification, Rob.
I know you studied physics, but I thought I'd clue the rest of the listenership in on the fact that rivers are made of water. We aim for accuracy on the podcast. The cat being buried in the river, or tossed into the river at any rate, calls to mind some very, very famous classical references, right? Some very famous poets were also drowned or buried in the water. Qu Yuan, for one, possibly the most famous, the writer of Songs of the South, or Chu Zi. Li Bai, at least according to legend, probably a legend, died in a river while reaching for the moon reflected in the water.
Supposedly, right? I thought he was toasting the moon while drinking.
Yeah.
While completely wasted.
Wasted, yes, and fell in the water. So there's a long tradition of very famous poets either drowning or falling in the water, right?
So Rob, are you reading the dead cat, Mr. Five White, as a metaphor for Mei Yaochen himself?
I'm not reading him as a metaphor for Mei Yaochen, although I'll be curious to know what you do with that. I'm more reading it as if you were going to write a sacrifice poem, like you said earlier. This is the cat sacrifice. This is the sort of epitaph, right? What cooler thing could you do than to say, you know what, at least in my heart, my cat is right up there with Qu Yuan and Li Bai. I'm just going to say it. Let's go there.
Certainly many of us cat lovers have felt that way.
Yes, I think when your cat Angel eventually dies, I'm pretty sure
we're going to dump her in the Willamette River and leave sushi on the side.
Excellent. I guarantee you're not the only person in Eugene to have done that, so that'll be fun. But you may be the only one comparing your cat to, I don't know, let's go with Susher or somebody. Anyway, but that's a pretty cool gesture. So that's kind of what I'm going for, is as sort of nitty-gritty and write about anything as song poets were, they were still poets. They knew their poetic references. I don't think this was just a random toss-off like, well, there was nowhere else to bury the cat, so whatever, I'll just throw him in the river, right?
Maybe. I mean, it's plausible. Certainly in this context. I wasn't sure, and I may be reading too much into this, but could we read Mr. Five White as a metaphor for the poet himself? I mean, traditionally, when poets in China complain about someone working hard and maybe being ignored, although Mr. Five White is not ignored, but he is described as working very hard. It's always a metaphor for the official, the bureaucrat serving the emperor. Do you see any of that here?
It's kind of hard to, because the specific tasks the cat is supposed to have done, I don't really see how. I'd be curious to see if you can make this work. How that, like, that the cat worked hard. That's yeah, and you're right. Like, a lot of poets have, or at least there's a tradition of metaphorizing the poet as a beleaguered worker of some kind. So that definitely makes sense. Like the line about lots of folks value animals that can pull a plow or drive a cart. They say that cats aren't as good as a horse or a mule. You can totally go there, right? The idea of the cat was useful because at least this poor poet didn't have to deal with mouse droppings in his food. Like it's very, very specific about the kind of labor the cat did. So I'm having a little trouble connecting that with what Mei Yaochen might have done.
That's actually a good point for something else I wanted to segue to. That line specifically, although my rations were thin, at least I didn't have to deal with having mice pissing in and eating my food. In the discussions that I had with folks on Reddit, that was my most controversial part of this translation. And I am still uncomfortable with that translation. Other people translated it as something like, at least you didn't have to eat leftovers. So I think that's a kind of tough line to translate. So there is an English version of this poem that I discovered. It's in the anthology edited by Victor Mayer called the Columbia Anthology of Traditional Chinese Literature. It refers in that line to mice droppings or mice urine. I forget exactly how Burton Watson does it. He does it slightly less colloquial than I did with the term mice pissing. But he still refers essentially to that. So I went with Burton Watson's translation. Anybody who reads classical Chinese, we're going to put this poem up on the website, both the original and the translation. Feel free in the comment section to leave us a message or send us an email. Do you like it? Do you not like that translation? Specifically that line, if you have any information on how, like, did Mei Yaochen or a previous poet have a similar kind of line like that? I would love to hear it. Rob, as we're wrapping this up, what did you take away from this poem?
Not a lot, honestly, but well, the
some
thing
sushi.
is though that some sushi, yeah, ideally anyway, but not. This is the other thing that's interesting though about a lot of the poetry from this era is that was it intended to be immortal? If you're already taking as your poetic framework an existing song, it's Big Pimpin' or whatever, and you threw some poetry on the top of that, are you really intending for it to be immortal, or are you just looking for a kind of a connection to be made? And in that sense, it's a really sweet poem. It's not one that I would expect to read from a quote-unquote great Chinese poet. And so that has its own charm and its own heft, because it would be like reading T.S. Eliot with a very, very easy-to-read poem about how much he likes soda bread or something.
Or how much he likes cats, right?
Or how much he likes cats. Why not?
He has poems about cats.
He has a lot of poems about cats. He wrote, Cats is based on his poems. Anyway, the musical, that is, not the animal. We're getting into a lot of science in this podcast. Very remedial science,
the
too.
word poet is Greek. It's derived from the word to create, from the verb to create. So, it wouldn't be that surprising if T.S. Eliot literally created all cats in the world.
Wow. That's an intense claim, man. I think you're going to have trouble with that one, but,
maybe.
But, yeah, so what did you take away from it?
I just felt like it was a lovely poem to this cat. You mentioned whether or not he's trying to write for the ages, to be immortal, but he does sort of immortalize his cat. I mean, how many other 11th century cats do you know of? We know Mr. Five White. Do we know any others? Are there that many others that we know from the 11th century? He's writing from, so he was born, we should have probably put this at the beginning of the podcast. He was born in 1002 AD and he died in 1060. So Mr. Five White lived sometime in there. How many other cats do you know from that period, Rob?
None. Although, I'm not a classical scholar. Perhaps there's a whole, Ji Mao Ji or something, like collection of sacrifice to cat writings or something.
If there's not, someone should.
Which we ever... And so, we have follow-up questions we could ask, like Lao She's Cat Planet. Was Lao She thinking about Mr. Five White? Like, you know what? We're bringing this back.
I don't recall this poem in that novel. You might have just missed it. But I think that, the thing about poetry is that it does immortalize the people it talks about if the poem is really good. And, here we are, you and I, Rob, you're on the other side of the Eurasian landmass from China. I'm on the other side of the Pacific. we're a millennium separated from Mei Yaochen, and yet we're still talking about his dead cat. I think that says quite a lot about the power of this poem.
I would agree. We're still talking about Mr. Five White a millennium after he's dead. So in that sense, I think Mei Yaochen succeeded pretty grandly.
And I think we succeeded pretty grandly in explicating this poem, Rob, if I can pat myself on the back here.
It's a good translation. It was a good translation.
Yeah, we'll put the translation up on the website along with the original. If you have any thoughts on it, please feel free to comment. Feel free to email us.
And also feel free, make sure you leave us a review on your podcasting platform of choice. That helps bring attention to the podcast. We love contact. We love hearing from people. So Chinlit Pod, that's Twitter, Chinese Lit Pod. Although we're not doing a lot on Instagram, but we'll look, if you send us something, we'll respond. And of course, email ChineseLiteraturePodcast@gmail.com. Patreon, Chinese Literature Podcast. We are still taking beer money submissions. So there you go.
And we've had several people in recent weeks write to us and let us know that they support us with beer money. We really appreciate it.
We do. We really do. It's pretty incredible having people who are into what we do enough to actually give us something for it. It's pretty awesome.
Yeah. Thank you again for doing that. And Rob, thanks for just hanging out and talking about Mr. Five White.
Wherever you are, Mr. Five White, we wish you well.
A 21 gun salute maybe before we leave.
We're not going to do the whole thing on the podcast.
I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.